I thought I knew my daughter Sarah until I sat in that sterile bank office watching her force a pen into my trembling hand while insisting I sign documents that would rob me of everything. The young cashier's eyes met mine as I secretly slipped her a crumpled note that read, "Help, I'm being forced to sign." When the manager's eyes went wide as dinner plates and his finger slammed down on the silent alarm, I knew my 3-year nightmare was finally ending. The police sirens wailing outside meant Sarah's elaborate scheme to steal my late husband's $2 million inheritance by having me declared mentally incompetent was crumbling. But getting to this moment had cost me almost everything I held dear. 3 years earlier, my world collapsed when my husband Frank clutched his chest during our morning coffee and never got up again. The heart attack took him so suddenly that I barely had time to call 911 before the paramedics were telling me there was nothing more they could do. 52 years of marriage ended in the span of 10 minutes, leaving me alone in our big house with nothing but memories and the overwhelming grief that felt like drowning in slow motion. Sarah arrived at the funeral home before I even thought to call her. "Mom, you can't go through this alone," she said, wrapping her arms around me as I stood numbly beside Frank's casket. "I'm taking time off work to help you get through this." Her words felt like a lifeline in the ocean of my despair. My only child, my beautiful daughter who lived 2 states away with her boyfriend, was putting her life on hold to care for her grieving mother. Within a week, Sarah had moved into Frank's study, converting it into a temporary bedroom. She took charge of everything with the efficiency of a battlefield medic. Bills that normally scattered across Frank's desk were organized into neat stacks. Appointment cards appeared on the refrigerator with military precision. The chaos of grief was being transformed into order, and I felt grateful beyond words. "You don't need to worry about anything practical right now," Sarah assured me as she sorted through insurance papers. "Focus on healing, I'll handle the rest." She began intercepting phone calls, explaining to friends that I needed space and quiet to process my loss. When our neighbor Betty called to invite me for lunch, Sarah gently declined on my behalf. "Mom's not ready for socializing yet," she told people. "The grief counselor says isolation is normal right now." I didn't remember talking to any grief counselor, but those early weeks were such a blur of pain that I assumed Sarah had arranged things while I wandered through the house like a ghost. She started accompanying me to every doctor's appointment, taking notes while I sat in a fog of sorrow. During one visit with Dr. Harrison, my longtime family physician, I mentioned feeling confused about some of Frank's financial arrangements. "She's been forgetting things," Sarah interjected smoothly. "Simple things like whether she took her medication or what day it is. Yesterday she asked me when Frank was coming home from work." The concern in her voice sounded so genuine that even I began to question my own memories. Dr. Harrison nodded sympathetically. "Grief can affect cognitive function temporarily. It's quite common for widows to experience some disorientation." He prescribed mild sedatives to help me sleep and suggested regular check-ins to monitor my adjustment. As weeks turned to months, I noticed fewer and fewer calls from friends. When I asked Sarah about our usual bridge club, she sighed sadly. "Mom, I explained to the ladies that you needed to step back from social commitments. They understood completely." When I mentioned wanting to visit Frank's grave with our neighbor Clara, Sarah shook her head gently. "Clara moved to Florida. Remember, you helped her pack last month." I stared at her blankly. I had no memory of helping Clara pack, but then again, I had no clear memories of much from those early grief-stricken weeks. Sarah's patient smile made me feel foolish for questioning her. "It's okay to be confused, Mom. Grief does terrible things to our minds." The neurological evaluations began 6 months after Frank's death. "Just to be safe," Sarah explained as we sat in the waiting room of the memory care clinic, "Dr. Harrison thinks it would be wise to establish a baseline for your cognitive function." I submitted to the tests, dutifully drawing clocks and reciting lists, while technicians measured the electrical activity in my brain. During these appointments, Sarah provided detailed examples of my supposed memory lapses to the medical staff. Stories about leaving the stove on, getting lost, driving to familiar places, forgetting the names of longtime neighbors. I wanted to correct her to explain that none of these incidents had actually happened, but the words seemed to stick in my throat when the doctors looked at me with such professional concern. Mrs. Collins, the neurologist said after reviewing my test results, "While we don't see signs of dementia, your daughter's observations suggest some concerning changes in your daily functioning. Grief-related cognitive decline is more common than people realize." He recommended follow-up testing in 6 months and encouraged Sarah to continue monitoring my behavior for any deterioration. That night, I called our neighbor Betty to ask if she remembered Clara moving away. The phone rang twice before a recorded message informed me that the number had been disconnected. Confused, I mentioned this to Sarah the next morning over breakfast. Her face crumpled with sorrow. "Oh, Mom," she whispered, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. "I'm so sorry. I should have told you sooner, but I didn't want to upset you while you were still processing Dad's death. Betty died in a car accident 3 weeks ago. The family had her phone disconnected after the funeral." The coffee cup slipped from my numb fingers, shattering against the kitchen floor as grief crashed over me again. Another loss, another friend gone while I had been too wrapped up in my own sorrow to even notice. Sarah cleaned up the broken pieces while I sobbed at the table, berating myself for being such a terrible friend that I hadn't even realized Betty was dead. It was only days later, while browsing through the local newspaper's obituary section, in a fit of morbid curiosity, that I found Betty's death notice. The date printed beneath her smiling photograph was from 2 days ago, not 3 weeks. My hand shook as I reread the small print confirming that Betty Martinez, age 73, had indeed died in a car accident, but the timeline Sarah had given me was completely wrong. A cold realization settled in my chest like ice water. Either my grief-addled mind was more damaged than I thought, or my daughter had deliberately lied to me about when our friend had died. But why would Sarah lie about something like that? The doubt planted by Betty's obituary grew like poison ivy in my mind, spreading tendrils of suspicion through every interaction I had with Sarah. I began paying closer attention during our medical appointments, and what I noticed made my blood run cold. During my next visit with Dr. Harrison, I secretly activated the voice recorder app on my old smartphone, hiding the device in my purse, while Sarah described my supposed symptoms. "The confusion is getting worse," Sarah told the doctor with practiced concern. "Last Tuesday, she called me at work asking why there were strangers living in her house. When I got there, she was hiding in the bedroom because the landscapers were trimming the hedges outside her window. She was convinced they were burglars." I opened my mouth to protest. We hadn't had landscapers in months, and I certainly hadn't called Sarah about strangers in the house. But Dr. Harrison was already nodding gravely, making notes in my file, while Sarah continued her fictional narrative. "And yesterday morning, I found her trying to cook breakfast at 2 in the morning. She insisted it was time for Frank to come down for his eggs, even though I've explained hundreds of times that Dad is gone. She became agitated when I tried to redirect her back to bed." Every word was a complete fabrication. I had slept soundly the previous night and eaten a normal breakfast at 7:30 in the morning, just as I had every day since Frank's death. But as I listened to Sarah weave these elaborate lies with tears glistening in her eyes, I realized she wasn't improvising. These stories were too detailed, too emotionally convincing to be spontaneous inventions. Dr. Harrison prescribed new medication to help with what he termed sundowning episodes and recommended increasing the frequency of my cognitive assessments. "Petra," he said gently, "I know this is difficult to hear, but your daughter's observations suggest we may be looking at early-stage dementia. The good news is that if we catch it early, medication can slow the progression significantly." I accepted the prescription bottle with trembling hands, nodding as he explained the dosing schedule. But when I got home, instead of taking the pills as directed, I hid them in an empty jewelry box in my bedroom. Within days of skipping the medication, my mind felt clearer and sharper than it had in months. The fog that had been clouding my thoughts since Frank's death began to lift, and I realized I could remember details and conversations with perfect clarity. The breakthrough came when I decided to follow Sarah after one of our medical appointments. While she spoke with Dr. Harrison in the parking lot, I watched from behind a concrete pillar as my daughter handed him a thick envelope. Even from 30 feet away, I could see the bulk of cash inside when the doctor briefly opened the flap to check the contents. Continue documenting the progression. Sarah's voice carried across the nearly empty parking lot. The court date is set for early next month, and I need stronger medical evidence for the competency hearing. Make sure your testimony emphasizes the safety concerns. Dr. Harrison pocketed the envelope smoothly. The latest evaluation results should be sufficient. I'll include specific incidents about her inability to manage finances and make sound decisions. Judge Patterson tends to favor medical testimony over family disputes. My legs nearly gave out as the full scope of Sarah's betrayal became clear. She was bribing my doctor to falsify medical records, building a case to have me declared legally incompetent so she could control my finances. I stumbled back to the car, mind reeling with the implications of what I had witnessed. That evening, while Sarah prepared dinner in the kitchen, I researched legal guardianship procedures on my laptop. The information I found made my stomach churn. If Sarah successfully convinced a judge that I was mentally incompetent, she would gain complete control over my property, finances, and medical decisions. I would become essentially a prisoner in my own life, unable to make any significant choices without her approval. Digging deeper into my own legal situation, I discovered that Sarah had already filed preliminary paperwork with the county court. According to the online records, a competency hearing was scheduled for just 6 weeks away. The petition described me as suffering from progressive dementia with episodes of paranoia and inability to manage daily living activities. Supporting documentation included medical reports from Dr. Harrison detailing my supposed cognitive decline and dangerous behaviors. My hands shook as I read Sarah's sworn statement describing incidents that had never happened. She claimed I had left the stove on overnight, gotten lost driving to the grocery store, and given hundreds of dollars to phone scammers. Each lie was crafted to paint a picture of a confused, vulnerable woman who could no longer be trusted with her own affairs. But the most chilling discovery came when I found a hidden folder in Sarah's room while she was at work. Inside were copies of medical reports I had never seen, describing severe cognitive impairment and recommending immediate intervention for my safety. The dates on the reports corresponded with appointments I remembered clearly, visits where Dr. Harrison had told me my test results were normal and my grief-related confusion was temporary. One report claimed I had scored poorly on memory tests that I distinctly remembered performing well on. Another described violent outbursts and paranoid delusions that existed only in Sarah's imagination. The medical evidence she was building against me was comprehensive, damning, and completely fraudulent. As I photographed each document with my phone, a terrible understanding settled over me. Frank's $2 million inheritance wasn't just money to Sarah. It was her ticket to solving some problem so urgent that she was willing to destroy her own mother's freedom to get it. But what could be driving her to such desperate measures? The answer to Sarah's desperation revealed itself when I found her laptop hidden beneath old sweaters in her bedroom closet. While she attended what she claimed was a job interview, I spent the afternoon exploring the digital trail of her secret life. What I discovered made me understand why she needed my inheritance so desperately. Her browser history read like a roadmap to financial ruin. Dozens of online gambling sites filled the screen, casino games, sports betting, poker rooms. The betting amounts made my heart pound. Sarah had been placing wagers of thousands of dollars multiple times daily for over 2 years. Some days showed losses exceeding $10,000 in just a few hours of frenzied gambling. I scrolled through her email accounts, finding a nightmare of financial desperation, hidden beneath the surface of the caring daughter who had been managing my household. Credit card statements showed maxed-out cards with minimum payments long overdue. Cash advance fees accumulated like compound interest, creating debt that grew faster than she could pay it down. Bank statements painted an even grimmer picture. Sarah's checking account had been overdrawn for months with overdraft fees piling up daily. She had taken out payday loans from multiple companies, each one requiring repayment at interest rates that would have made Frank, who worked in banking for 30 years, absolutely furious. But the most terrifying discoveries were the messages from people whose names I didn't recognize. Text threads with someone identified only as Tony contained increasingly urgent demands for payment. Your payment is 3 weeks late. This stops being friendly tomorrow. Another message from a number with no name attached read, 48 hours to settle your account, or we involve your family. We know where your mother lives. I sat frozen at Sarah's desk, understanding flooding through me like ice water. My daughter owed massive debts to loan sharks. The threats weren't just about money anymore. They were about physical safety. Sarah needed my inheritance not out of greed, but out of pure terror. Further investigation revealed the depth of her financial hole. She owed over $400,000 to various creditors, including what appeared to be 3 different illegal lending operations. The interest rates on these debts were astronomical, designed to trap borrowers in cycles of ever-increasing payments. The most shocking discovery came when I found mortgage documents in her email. Sarah had somehow taken out a second mortgage on our family home, forging my signature, using a power of attorney document I had signed months earlier for what she claimed were convenience purposes in managing household bills. $300,000 of home equity had been borrowed against the house Frank and I had owned free and clear for 15 years. According to the loan statements, that money was already gone, spent servicing her gambling debts and paying off the most dangerous creditors. Our house, the home where I had planned to live out my remaining years, was now collateral for debts I knew nothing about. Sarah's voicemail messages told the rest of the story. Creditors called multiple times daily, their voices progressing from professional reminders to barely contained threats. This is your final notice before we turn your account over to our collections department. One message began ominously. Another caller didn't bother with pleasantries. You know what happens to people who don't pay their debts to us, Sarah. Make this right before we make it right for you. The most chilling message came from Tony, whose earlier text threats had already scared me. Your mother seems like a nice lady, his gravelly voice said through the phone speaker. Lives alone in that big house since your father passed. Shame if something happened to such a sweet old woman because her daughter can't manage her finances. I realized with growing horror that Sarah's plan to have me declared incompetent wasn't just about accessing my money. It was about survival. She needed that inheritance to pay off people who would hurt both of us if they didn't get their money. But her solution involved destroying my freedom and autonomy to save herself from consequences of her own choices. More emails revealed that Sarah had been secretly meeting with a lawyer who specialized in what he called expedited conservatorships. For an additional fee, he promised to fast-track the legal process that would give Sarah control over my finances. His business card, which I found in her wallet, advertised emergency guardianship services and rapid asset protection solutions. The timeline became clear as I pieced together her communications. Sarah's largest creditors had given her until the end of the month to settle her accounts. The competency hearing was scheduled for just days before that deadline. If everything went according to her plan, she would gain access to Frank's inheritance just in time to save herself from whatever consequences Tony and his associates had in mind. That evening, I listened from the hallway as Sarah spoke on her phone in hushed, urgent tones. I told you the money will be available within days, she whispered. The hearing is next week, and once I have legal control, I can access the inheritance immediately. Just give me until Friday. The voice on the other end was loud enough for me to hear through the phone. Friday is your absolute deadline, Sarah. We've been patient because we like you, but our patience has limits. Your mother's house is nice, but it won't cover what you owe if we have to foreclose on the mortgage. You won't have to foreclose, Sarah said quickly. The inheritance is $2 million, more than enough to settle everything and start fresh. It better be, Tony's voice replied coldly, because if you're lying to us about this money, we're going to solve this problem the permanent way, and your mother will pay the price for your mistakes. After she hung up, I heard Sarah crying in her room for the first time since she had moved in. But instead of feeling sympathy for her distress, I felt a steely resolve forming in my chest. My daughter was planning to sacrifice my freedom to save herself from debts she had chosen to accumulate. She was willing to have me locked away as an incompetent person rather than face the consequences of her gambling addiction. With the full scope of Sarah's plan finally clear, I realized I had to be smarter than she was if I wanted to survive with my freedom intact. The next morning, I began what I privately called my performance of a lifetime, acting increasingly confused and dependent while secretly preparing my counterattack. I started asking repetitive questions, pretending to forget conversations we had just finished. "What day is it again?" I would ask Sarah multiple times during breakfast, watching her face light up with satisfaction as she gently repeated the information. When she reminded me to take my medication, I made a show of struggling with the bottle caps and appearing grateful for her assistance. The more helpless I appeared, the more careless Sarah became with her planning. She started taking phone calls about the court hearing without bothering to leave the room, confident that her confused mother wouldn't understand the significance of legal terminology. She discussed strategy with her lawyer right in front of me, treating me like a piece of furniture rather than a person capable of listening and understanding. But while I performed confusion during the day, I spent my nights working on a plan that would expose her scheme and protect my inheritance. My first call was to Joseph Martinez Frank's longtime lawyer, whom Sarah had told me was retired and couldn't be reached. Petra. Joseph's familiar voice boomed through the phone when I called his office. "I've been trying to reach you for months. Where have you been?" His surprise was genuine, and I quickly realized that Sarah had been intercepting all correspondence between us. "Sarah told me you had retired," I explained carefully, keeping my voice low since she was sleeping in the next room. "She said you moved to Arizona for your health." Joseph's laugh was bitter. "I'm healthier than ever and busier than I want to be. Your daughter contacted me months ago and said you wanted to handle Frank's estate matters with a different lawyer. She claimed you were angry about something and never wanted to speak to me again." The manipulation ran deeper than I had even suspected. Sarah had systematically cut me off from every professional and personal relationship that might have interfered with her plans. Joseph explained that the IRS had been trying to contact me about required documentation for Frank's estate, but Sarah had apparently intercepted and hidden all official correspondence. "You've got penalties and interest accumulating on the estate taxes," Joseph warned. "Sarah's been stalling the required filings, which is actually creating problems that didn't exist before. If we don't get this resolved soon, you could lose a significant portion of the inheritance to federal penalties." I realized that Sarah's delays weren't just about building medical evidence for incompetency. She was also creating artificial urgency around the estate taxes to pressure me into signing documents quickly once she gained legal control. Joseph agreed to help me file an emergency injunction to stop the competency hearing and began preparing documentation to expose Sarah's fraud. While Joseph worked on the legal strategy, I focused on gathering evidence of Sarah's deception. I downloaded a recording app on my smartphone and began documenting every interaction we had. When Sarah coached me on what to tell the court evaluator, I captured her exact words. "Just say you feel confused about money, Mom. Tell them you don't understand the bank statements and that you trust me to handle everything." Her boyfriend Derek visited more frequently as the court date approached, and I pretended to nap in my chair while they discussed what they called Phase 2 of their plan. Derek worked at Shady Pines Psychiatric Facility, a private institution with a reputation for accepting patients whose families paid premium rates for long-term care. "Once you have guardianship," Derek explained to Sarah, "I can recommend your mother for psychiatric evaluation at our facility. We'll say she's become dangerous to herself, maybe attempted suicide with an overdose of her dementia medication." Sarah's voice was tense with excitement. "How long would she have to stay there?" "As long as you want," Derek replied casually. "Once someone is committed for psychiatric evaluation, especially an elderly person with documented dementia, Families can keep them institutionalized indefinitely. You'd have complete control over all her finances with no oversight from the court. The casual way they discussed destroying my life made my blood run cold. I wasn't just losing my freedom, I was being planned into a living death in an institution where no one would believe my protests of sanity. Sarah intended to lock me away permanently, while she used my inheritance to solve her gambling debts. I recorded every word of their conversation, my phone hidden beneath a throw pillow, while I maintained steady breathing to appear asleep. They discussed timing logistics and even which medications Derek could use to make me appear suicidal during the psychiatric evaluation. The beauty of this plan, Derek said, is that elderly people who claim their families are stealing from them are automatically flagged as paranoid. Even if your mother tries to tell people about your gambling debts, it will just prove she's delusional. Sarah laughed, and the sound made me sick to my stomach. It's perfect. Her own accurate accusations will be used as evidence that she's mentally ill. But the most terrifying discovery came when I found a bottle of sleeping pills hidden in my bedroom drawer that I had never purchased. The prescription label bore my name and Dr. Harrison's signature, but I had no memory of receiving this medication. The bottle was nearly full, containing enough pills to make a fake suicide attempt look convincing. Sarah was already setting up the props for Derek's fake overdose scenario. All the pieces were in place for her to drug me unconscious, call emergency services, claiming I had attempted suicide, and have me committed to Derek's psychiatric facility before I regained consciousness. Once there, any protests I made about fraud or coercion would be dismissed as the paranoid delusions of a mentally ill elderly woman. The court hearing was scheduled for Monday morning, just 4 days away. According to the text messages I had been monitoring on Sarah's phone, Tony expected his money by Friday afternoon. The timeline was impossibly tight, but Sarah seemed confident that everything would proceed smoothly. She had Dr. Harrison prepared to testify about my deteriorating mental state and dangerous behaviors. Derek was standing by to recommend immediate psychiatric intervention, following the competency ruling. Joseph Martinez was working frantically to file legal challenges, but court schedules moved slowly, and Sarah had a months-long head start on her preparations. I realized that Monday morning might be my last chance to expose the truth before being trapped in a web of legal decisions made on my behalf by people who intended to destroy my life. Everything depended on reaching the bank before Sarah could execute her final plan. That Sunday night, Sarah prepared my evening tea with unusual attention to detail. I watched her stir something into the cup before bringing it to me with a loving smile. "This will help you sleep well before your big day tomorrow, Mom." I accepted the tea, gratefully taking small sips while she watched. But when she left to take a phone call, I poured the drugged liquid into a houseplant and rinsed the cup thoroughly. Whatever she had added to the tea, I suspected it was meant to keep me groggy and compliant during what she had described as a routine medical appointment the next morning. As I lay in bed that night, listening to Sarah make final preparations in the next room, I knew that tomorrow would determine whether I spent my remaining years as a free woman or as a prisoner in an institution forgotten by the world, while my own daughter spent my inheritance to save herself. Monday morning arrived with the gray promise of rain matching the darkness I felt as Sarah woke me earlier than usual with artificial cheerfulness. "Today's the day for your appointment, Mom," she said brightly, helping me dress in my best navy blue dress. "Remember, just answer the questions simply and let me handle any complicated details." I performed my role flawlessly, moving slowly and appearing confused about why we were getting ready so early. "Where are we going again?" I asked, repeatedly, watching Sarah's confidence grow with each display of my supposed helplessness. She had no idea that I felt sharper and more determined than I had in months. "Just a routine appointment with a specialist," Sarah explained patiently. "He needs to ask you some questions about how you're feeling lately. Nothing to worry about." But instead of driving toward the medical complex where Dr. Harrison's office was located, Sarah turned toward downtown. When I asked about the change in direction, she gave me a reassuring smile. "We have to stop at the bank first, Mom. Just some quick paperwork to update your account information. My heart began pounding as I realized Sarah had moved up her timeline. Instead of waiting for the court hearing to gain legal control of my finances, she was attempting to access my accounts immediately using forged documents. The pressure from Tony and her other creditors must have forced her to accelerate her plans. First National Bank's lobby was nearly empty at 8:30 in the morning, with only one teller window open for early customers. Sarah guided me to a chair in the waiting area while she approached the reception desk, speaking in low tones with the security guard. "My mother needs to update her account access," I heard her explain. "We have all the necessary legal paperwork." She produced a manila folder thick with official-looking documents, her performance of concerned daughter, flawless to any casual observer. Within minutes, we were escorted to a private office where the bank manager, Carl Thompson, reviewed Sarah's paperwork with impressive thoroughness. The documents she presented looked completely authentic power of attorney forms, medical affidavits, and what appeared to be court orders declaring me mentally incompetent and appointing Sarah as my legal guardian. "These appear to be in order," Thompson said, though I noticed he spent considerable time examining the court seal on one document. "Mrs. Collins, do you understand that these papers give your daughter authority to make financial decisions on your behalf?" I nodded slowly, maintaining my confused demeanor while my mind raced. "Sarah takes care of everything now," I said in a small voice. "I get mixed up with numbers." Sarah squeezed my shoulder affectionately. "Mom's been struggling since Dad passed away. The doctors say it's best if I handle the complicated financial matters." Her performance was so convincing that even I almost believed her genuine concern. Thompson pulled out signature cards and account transfer forms. "We'll need your mother to sign these documents authorizing the account changes," he explained to Sarah. "It's bank policy, even with guardianship papers." This was the moment I had been preparing for. While Sarah arranged the papers in front of me and placed a pen in my hand, I used my body to shield my other hand as I quickly wrote a note on a small piece of paper I had prepared. The message was simple, but urgent. "Help, I'm being forced to sign. Sarah is stealing my inheritance. Call police." "Just sign here, Mom," Sarah said gently, guiding my hand toward the signature line. "It's routine paperwork to keep your accounts safe." I picked up the pen slowly, then made a show of feeling confused about which document to sign first. "I need to ask the nice young lady a question," I said, gesturing toward Jennifer Walsh, the cashier who had been processing routine transactions during our meeting. Jennifer approached our table with a professional smile. "How can I help you, Mrs. Collins?" While Sarah and Thompson discussed account details, I pretended to need help understanding one of the forms. As Jennifer leaned closer to examine the paperwork, I slipped the folded note directly into her palm, maintaining eye contact just long enough to ensure she understood this was intentional. Jennifer's reaction was immediate but subtle. She unfolded the note below table level, read it quickly, then made eye contact with me again. I gave the slightest nod, and she excused herself from our table with professional composure. "I need to verify some account details," Jennifer told Thompson. "I'll be right back with the information you need." But instead of checking account records, Jennifer went directly to Thompson's desk phone and made a quiet call. Within moments, Thompson received what appeared to be an internal message. He excused himself briefly, returning with a different demeanor entirely. "Mrs. Collins," Thompson said, "I need to ask you some specific questions about these guardianship documents. Can you tell me when this court hearing took place?" Sarah's face flushed slightly. "The hearing was last Friday afternoon," she said quickly. "The judge expedited the case due to Mom's deteriorating condition." But Thompson was now examining the court documents with a magnifying glass, studying details that had apparently escaped his initial review. "I'm seeing some inconsistencies in these official seals," he said carefully, "and this judge's signature doesn't match other documents we have on file from his court." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees as Thompson continued his examination. "I'm also noting that these medical affidavits are dated after the supposed court hearing date, which would be impossible if they were used as evidence in the proceeding." Sarah's composure began to crack. There must be some clerical error, she said, her voice rising slightly. I can call the court to clarify any administrative confusion. But Thompson was already pressing a button under his desk, and I realized Jennifer had alerted security about my note. Actually, Mrs. Collins, he said, I think we need to slow this process down and verify these documents through proper channels. That's when I decided to drop my confused elderly woman act entirely. Mr. Thompson, I said clearly, my daughter has been lying to you. She's forged these documents because she owes hundreds of thousands of dollars to loan sharks and needs my inheritance to pay them off. Sarah's face went completely white. Mom, you're confused, she said desperately. Remember what Dr. Harrison said about your paranoid thoughts? I remember everything perfectly, I replied, pulling out my smartphone, including the conversations you've been having with your boyfriend Derek about having me committed to a psychiatric facility after stealing my money. I played back several seconds of recorded conversation, Sarah's voice clearly audible, discussing her plans to have me declared suicidal. Thompson's eyes widened as he heard the recording. Mrs. Collins, he said to Sarah, I think you need to remain seated while we sort this out. But Sarah was already standing, panic evident in her voice. This is ridiculous. My mother is clearly having a psychotic episode. You can't take the word of someone with dementia over legitimate legal documents. The office door opened as bank security entered, followed immediately by police officers who had apparently been called by Jennifer. Ma'am, one of the officers said to Sarah, we need you to remain calm and answer some questions about these documents. Sarah made a desperate attempt to flee, pushing past the security guard toward the exit, but she had left her purse and car keys on Thompson's desk in her panic, and she was quickly apprehended in the lobby by additional officers who had stationed themselves at all exits. As Sarah was handcuffed, she screamed at me with pure hatred. You crazy old witch! You'll die alone and penniless when Tony and his people come for you. But her threats carried no power anymore. Federal agents arrived within an hour explaining that Sarah's identity theft operation was part of a larger investigation they had been conducting for months. Dr. Harrison and Derek were already in custody, having been arrested earlier that morning based on evidence I had provided to Joseph Martinez. The scope of the criminal enterprise was staggering. Sarah Derek and Dr. Harrison had been targeting elderly people across 3 states, using the same pattern of fake medical diagnoses and forged court documents to steal inheritances and property. Over 37 families had been victimized by their coordinated scheme. My recordings became crucial evidence in prosecuting the entire network. The federal agents explained that my decision to document Sarah's coaching sessions and Derek's planning conversations provided the kind of clear evidence that financial crimes cases often lacked. As Sarah was led away in handcuffs, still screaming about my paranoid delusions, I felt a mixture of relief and profound sadness. I had saved my inheritance and my freedom, but I had lost my only child in the process. The daughter I had raised and loved had been willing to destroy my life to save herself from consequences she had chosen to risk. The investigation that followed Sarah's arrest revealed layers of deception that went far beyond what I had uncovered on my own. Federal agents spent weeks unraveling the sophisticated fraud network that had targeted dozens of families across the region, with Sarah serving as one of several coordinators who identified potential victims. The process began with Derek, whose job at Shady Pines Psychiatric Facility gave him access to information about elderly patients and their families. He would identify wealthy seniors who were dealing with grief health problems or social isolation, then pass their information to accomplices who would begin the grooming process. Dr. Harrison's role was crucial to the scheme's success. As a licensed physician with an established practice, he provided the medical credibility needed to convince courts that elderly patients were incompetent. For a fee of $10,000 per case, he would falsify medical records, prescribe unnecessary medications to create confusion, and testify in competency hearings about non-existent symptoms. Sarah's specialty was what the investigators called family infiltration. She would identify elderly people whose adult children lived far away or had complicated relationships with their parents. Using publicly available obituary information and social media research, she would create detailed backgrounds that allowed her to pose as a concerned relative or family friend. In my case, Sarah's approach had been different because she was actually my daughter. But the federal agents explained that she had been living a double life for years, maintaining her gambling addiction, while working with Derek to identify potential victims among his facility's patient families. The threatening loan sharks, including Tony, turned out to be part of the same criminal network. They weren't legitimate creditors demanding repayment. They were accomplices who created artificial urgency to pressure Sarah into completing her fraudulent schemes quickly. The gambling debts were real, but they were owed to online operations that Tony and his associates controlled. This revelation was perhaps the most devastating. Even Sarah's addiction and desperation had been orchestrated to manipulate me more effectively. The urgent timeline, the threatening phone calls I had overheard, the cash demands that pressured her to accelerate her plans, all of it had been theater designed to make her seem like a victim of circumstances rather than a calculating criminal. Dr. Harrison's cooperation with federal investigators revealed the full scope of the medical fraud. He had been falsifying records for over 2 years, targeting elderly patients whose families were willing to pay for expedited guardianship proceedings. His office files contained detailed profiles of dozens of victims, including their financial assets, family relationships, and psychological vulnerabilities. The forged court documents that Sarah had presented at the bank were masterpieces of criminal craftsmanship. The federal agents explained that the fraud network included a former court clerk who had access to official seals and judicial signatures. For $5,000, he could produce guardianship orders that were virtually indistinguishable from legitimate court documents. Derek's psychiatric facility had been serving as the final destination for many of the fraud victims. Once families gained guardianship through fake medical evidence, Derek would recommend immediate psychiatric commitment for the elderly person's safety. Shady Pines received premium payments for housing these patients, while the criminal guardians gained unrestricted access to their assets. The investigation revealed that at least 12 elderly people were currently being held at Shady Pines under false psychiatric commitments. Federal agents worked with legitimate medical professionals to evaluate these patients, finding that most were mentally competent and had been institutionalized against their will through fraudulent legal proceedings. Sarah's sentencing hearing provided the final chapter in our family's destruction. Facing federal charges for elder abuse, fraud, conspiracy, and racketeering, she received 15 years in federal prison. Derek was sentenced to 12 years, while Dr. Harrison lost his medical license and received 10 years behind bars. The fake loan sharks, including Tony, were prosecuted under organized crime statutes and received sentences ranging from 8 to 20 years. The court clerk who had forged official documents was sentenced to 5 years and ordered to pay restitution to all victims of his fraudulent paperwork. During Sarah's sentencing, the judge allowed victim impact statements from families who had been targeted by the fraud network. I chose not to speak, feeling that the pain of betrayal by my own daughter was too personal for a public courtroom. But I listened as other elderly victims described losing their homes, their savings, and their freedom to this coordinated criminal enterprise. One woman, Martha Stevens, had been held at Shady Pines for 18 months, while her supposed nephew drained her retirement accounts. Another victim, Robert Chen, had lost his family farm to fraudulent mortgage documents, signed during a fake competency hearing. The human cost of the network's crimes was staggering, affecting not just the direct victims, but their legitimate family members who had to fight through courts to restore their loved ones' rights and property. The restitution process took months to complete, but ultimately most victims recovered their stolen assets. My inheritance was fully restored with the fraudulent mortgage on our family home voided and all associated debts assigned to Sarah's criminal restitution obligations. Joseph Martinez worked tirelessly to untangle the legal complications Sarah's scheme had created. The IRS penalties that had been accumulating due to her interference were waived once federal agents explained that her delays had been part of a criminal conspiracy. Frank's estate was finally properly settled with all tax obligations resolved and the inheritance transferred to secure accounts under my sole control. But beyond the financial recovery, I had to rebuild relationships that Sarah had systematically destroyed through her manipulation. Betty Martinez, whom Sarah had falsely claimed was dead, welcomed me back into her life with understanding and forgiveness. Our bridge club resumed its weekly meetings with several new members who had heard about my ordeal and wanted to offer support. The most difficult part of moving forward was accepting that the daughter I had loved and trusted had never really existed. The Sarah who had cared for me after Frank's death, who had seemed so devoted and protective, had been performing a role designed to position herself for the ultimate theft of my life's savings. Therapy helped me understand that grief and trauma can make people vulnerable to manipulation, even from those closest to them. The counselor I worked with specialized in elder abuse cases and helped me recognize that Sarah's grooming process had been sophisticated and deliberate, designed to exploit the natural trust between mother and daughter. The months following Sarah's conviction brought a peace I hadn't experienced since Frank's death, but it was a different kind of peace than I had known before. It was the hard-won serenity of someone who had looked evil in the face and refused to be destroyed by it. I sold our big family home, unable to live comfortably in a space where so much deception had taken place. My new house was smaller, but perfectly suited to my needs, located just 10 minutes from Joseph Martinez's law office, in a neighborhood filled with people my own age who understood the value of community and mutual support. The federal investigation had revealed that 37 families across 3 states had been victimized by the fraud network, but the scope of similar operations was much larger. Elder fraud had become a multi-billion-dollar criminal industry, targeting the most vulnerable members of our society, with increasingly sophisticated schemes. I decided to transform my traumatic experience into something that could help protect other elderly Americans from similar exploitation. Working with federal law enforcement agencies and elder rights organizations, I began speaking at community centers, senior living facilities, and family law conferences about recognizing the warning signs of financial manipulation. My presentations focused on the specific tactics that had been used against me: isolation from friends and family, medical gaslighting, forged legal documents, and artificial time pressure created by fake emergencies. The audience response was always powerful, with many people approaching me afterward to share their own experiences with suspicious family members or caregivers. The Frank Petra Memorial Foundation became my full-time focus, named in honor of my husband's memory, and dedicated to helping elder abuse survivors rebuild their lives. The foundation provided legal assistance counseling services and emergency financial support for elderly people who had been victimized by family members or professional criminals. Joseph Martinez joined the foundation's board of directors, donating his legal expertise to help other families navigate the complex process of recovering from financial fraud. We worked with state legislators to strengthen guardianship laws, making it more difficult for criminals to obtain false court orders, declaring elderly people incompetent. Betty Martinez became one of my closest allies in the foundation work, using her background in social work to develop support groups for elder abuse survivors. These weekly meetings provided a safe space for people to share their experiences and learn from others who had faced similar betrayals. One of our most successful programs paired elder fraud survivors with volunteers who helped them rebuild social connections that had been damaged by manipulative family members. Many victims had been isolated from friends and community organizations for months or years, leaving them vulnerable to depression and continued exploitation. Dr. Harrison's conviction led to systemic changes in how medical professionals were monitored for fraudulent activity. New regulations required multiple physician signatures for competency evaluations, and state medical boards implemented random audits of doctors who frequently testified in guardianship proceedings. Shady Pines Psychiatric Facility was shut down permanently with legitimate mental health organizations taking over care for patients who actually needed psychiatric treatment. The facility's closure led to broader investigations of private psychiatric institutions that accepted long-term patients without adequate oversight. Derek's conviction resulted in new background check requirements for employees at elder care facilities and mandatory reporting protocols for staff who suspected family members were abusing or defrauding residents. His case became a cautionary tale used in training programs for healthcare workers across the country. The ripple effects of exposing this fraud network extended far beyond our immediate case. Federal agents used evidence from our investigation to identify and prosecute similar operations in 12 other states, ultimately breaking up what prosecutors described as one of the largest elder fraud conspiracies in American history. 2 years after Sarah's conviction, I received a letter from her in federal prison. She claimed to have found religion and asked for my forgiveness, insisting that her gambling addiction had made her desperate enough to make terrible choices. But there was no acknowledgement of the deliberate cruelty involved in her scheme, no recognition of the trauma she had inflicted by making me doubt my own sanity. I showed the letter to my therapist, who helped me understand that forgiveness didn't require maintaining a relationship with someone who had proven capable of such betrayal. I wrote back once, explaining that while I hoped she found peace in her remaining years, I could not have any ongoing contact with her. Some boundaries once crossed cannot be uncrossed. My work with the foundation introduced me to hundreds of other elderly people who had survived various forms of abuse and fraud. Their stories taught me that resilience isn't about avoiding hardship. It's about refusing to let hardship define the rest of your life. I met Margaret Thompson, whose son had forged her signature to refinance her home and steal the equity. She used her settlement money to start a nonprofit organization that provided free legal clinics for elderly homeowners facing foreclosure fraud. Robert Chen, the farmer whose nephew had tried to steal his land, became an advocate for stronger oversight of power of attorney documents. His testimony before Congress led to new federal protections for elderly property owners. Martha Stevens, who had been institutionalized for 18 months while her fake nephew drained her accounts, started a support network for family members trying to locate elderly relatives who had disappeared into fraudulent guardianship systems. Each of these survivors had transformed their painful experiences into tools for protecting other vulnerable people. Their courage and determination inspired my own continued work with the foundation and reminded me that justice isn't just about punishment, it's about preventing future victims. On quiet evenings in my new home, I often reflected on the lessons Frank's death and Sarah's betrayal had taught me. Grief had made me vulnerable, but it had also revealed strengths I didn't know I possessed. When faced with the choice between becoming a victim and becoming a fighter, I had chosen to fight. The most important lesson was about the difference between trust and wisdom. Trust is given freely to those we love, but wisdom requires us to pay attention when someone's actions don't match their words. Sarah had counted on my maternal love, making me blind to her deception, but ultimately, that same love motivated me to protect myself and seek justice. Sometimes people ask me if I regret having children knowing how Sarah turned out. The answer is complicated. I regret the pain she caused, and I grieve for the daughter I thought I knew. But I don't regret the love I gave her, even if it wasn't returned genuinely. Love given freely is never wasted, even when it's betrayed. The Foundation's work continues to grow, with new volunteers joining our mission every month. We've helped over 200 families recover from various forms of elder fraud, and our educational programs have reached thousands of elderly Americans who are now better equipped to protect themselves from financial predators. My testimony before congressional committees has contributed to new federal legislation, strengthening penalties for elder fraud and improving coordination between law enforcement agencies investigating these crimes. The Sarah Petra Elder Protection Act Named ironically after my daughter makes it a federal crime to falsify medical records for the purpose of obtaining fraudulent guardianship orders. Looking back on this journey, I'm struck by how much strength can be found in the darkest moments of our lives. When I sat in that bank office slipping a desperate note to a young cashier, I had no idea that moment would lead to exposing a criminal network that had victimized dozens of families. Today, as I prepare for another speaking engagement at a senior center in Phoenix, I carry with me the voices of all the elderly Americans who have shared their stories with me. Their courage in rebuilding their lives after betrayal reminds me daily that age doesn't make us helpless. It gives us the wisdom and determination to fight back against those who would prey on our supposed vulnerability. The young cashier Jennifer Walsh, who read my note that day, has become a friend and foundation volunteer. She often tells people that my case taught her to pay attention when elderly customers seem distressed, and she's since helped identify several other suspicious situations involving potential elder abuse. Bank manager Carl Thompson implemented new training protocols for his staff about recognizing signs of financial elder abuse, and First National Bank became the first institution in our state to require secondary verification for all guardianship-related account changes. As I finish preparing my presentation for tomorrow's audience, I'm reminded that sometimes the people who hurt us most are those who know exactly how to manipulate our love for them. But when we find our voice and refuse to be victims, we discover strength we never knew we had. That strength becomes our gift to others who face similar battles, proof that it's never too late to fight back and reclaim our lives. Have you ever noticed warning signs that someone you trusted might be taking advantage of an elderly family member? The stories I've shared today aren't unique. They happen to thousands of families every year. If this story resonated with you, please share it with others who might benefit from knowing these warning signs. Like this video, if it helped you understand the tactics financial predators use against our most vulnerable citizens. Subscribe to hear more stories about ordinary people who found extraordinary courage when it mattered most. And please share your own experiences in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear to protect themselves or a loved one. Thank you for listening to my journey from victim to survivor to advocate. Remember, it's never too late to stand up for yourself, and you're never too old to fight back against those who would steal your dignity along with your money. May you always trust your instincts, protect your independence, and never let anyone convince you that being older means being powerless.